I'm Harold Holzer. I am the Jonathan Fanton Director of Roosevelt House, and on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, Hunter's president, I want to thank you for braving the rain and the traffic and all of the impediments to beginning our fall program season here at Roosevelt House. We're glad to see you. This is not only the first event of the season for us, it's the beginning of a new partnership, a collaboration that we are hoping will progress and flower in the seasons to come with our friends at the India Center. And I want to thank Raul Bhavnani, who you will hear from shortly, whose work I've known and admired since my Metropolitan Museum days. Thank him for reaching out in behalf of the center with the idea of citing tonight's event in this historic setting. I want to thank Hunter's own Manu Bhagavan for inspiring us to do this as well, and Shama Venkateshwar, who is on the panel and you will hear from soon. So before I invite Raul to provide his own welcome, I want to just take a moment, as I always do, to recall an extraordinary family that lived in this house for 25 years until they left in 1933 for the presidential inaugural. As you know, this was the home base and certainly the home political base of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. We are thrilled that they not only dwelled in the Hunter community, but that Eleanor made it a point to acquaint herself with Hunter College during her residence here, even if it was only to get away from her mother-in-law. But she at least found refuge at the Hunter Library, invited Hunter girls to spend time in this house while her president was, while her husband was governor and president-elect. And of course, when Sarah Delano Roosevelt died and FDR decided to sell the house, it's interesting that he felt he could never cross its threshold again after he lost his mother. FDR accepted the idea of selling the house at a discount to Hunter College instead of selling it for $60,000. Yes, the whole house. He sold it for $50,000 and even gave Hunter College $1,000 to start the fundraising. So $49,000 was the price in the real estate deal of the century. And as you probably know, it became a center for girls of all nations and races and religions. We still hear stories from alumni who learned English in these rooms and met people of different races and religions for the first time in this house. But it deteriorated and was revived again 15 years ago when it was in a dilapidated condition. And Jennifer Rabb, as you know, raised the money necessary to rebuild this house and preserve it, dig this auditorium into the basement of the house and create a space for meetings and public events. So it's always an extraordinary privilege to use it for gatherings to discuss issues of the day. We are aware, too, that I was looking back into Roosevelt's correspondence and found this extraordinary letter that was written to him at the beginning of World War II, in about May of 1942. And it's a moment, since we're 2 weeks from the birthday of the person who wrote it. I wanted to share it with you because it'll bring us to Raul and the introduction of the program. So this is right after America's entry into World War II. Dear friend, it begins. Many of my countrymen have received and are still receiving higher education in America. There's something that might have even involved Hunter and Roosevelt House at the time. I know, too, that several have taken shelter in the United States. There's something that is worth discussing again. I have profited greatly by the writings of Americans like Thoreau and Emerson. I say this to tell you how much I am connected with your country. My personal position is clear. I hate all war. If, therefore, I could persuade my countrymen, they would make a most effective and decisive contribution in favor of peace. but I know that all of us have not living faith in nonviolence. So if the Allies think it necessary, yes, they may keep their troops at their own expense in India for not keeping internal order, but for preventing aggression. But so far as India is concerned, we must become free even as America is free. I hope that you will not regard this letter as an intrusion, but take it as an approach from a friend and well-wisher. I remain yours sincerely, M.K. Gandhi, to Roosevelt in 1942. It's a wonderful connection linking Gandhi to Roosevelt that I wasn't aware of. Tonight's assessment of where we all are, particularly women, and how far they've come since in that unending quest for liberty and equality. To launch that conversation, it's a pleasure to welcome the panel tonight, and it's a pleasure to welcome the person who brought it here, Raul Bhavnani. Raul?
Thanks so much, Harold, for that gracious and eloquent introduction. I really appreciate it, and also to Shama Venkateswar, who really was sort of my partner in crime on this idea and this partnership. Thank you. To Jen Kalidas, somewhere in the room, thank you for pulling all the pieces together, and Manu Bhagavan, of course, and the whole team. And thank you, of course, in advance to all of you panelists. It's really, really helpful to have you all here speaking on this. We also have two co-sponsors tonight, FTI Consulting's WIN Women's Network and the Council of Urban Professionals are co-sponsoring with us tonight. Your partnership means a lot to us. This evening specifically represents an important new dimension for the India Center Foundation. We are a young organization, small organization. We've only been in existence for a little over a year. And we've been focused very much on the Indian cultural identity here in the United States, the arts, the immigrant experience, and the relationship between India and the United States. In our first year of life as a nonprofit, our organization has really focused mostly on programs in the arts. We've done film, we've done music, we've done books, we've done visual arts, and the like. But in our second year, we were very intentional that we wanted to start to build out a new dimension focused on public policy, leadership, politics, social justice, and issues of the day, what we are calling public affairs. And this is clearly important given everything that's going on in this country, and frankly, everything that's going on in India and South Asia in the region and the relationship between the two countries. Increasingly, you are also seeing members of the Indian diaspora here stepping forward into leadership roles, and that's a large part of what we will talk about tonight. And leadership in many dimensions, not just in business and professional services, but also in politics, increasingly, in the arts, in nonprofits and academia. But clearly, as a community, we still have a ways to go in terms of organization, resources, clout, etc. And we hope to explore these important issues of leadership, the important cultural dimensions that are behind them for this community as we think about the future. And for all of you, I hope you'll stick around afterwards for a reception. All of the panelists will be available. We'll be happy to continue the conversation. Please also come to all of our events. Follow us on social media. We have a lot more that's set up for the rest of this year and in 2018. So with that, I will turn it over to the panel's moderator, Rupal, to introduce the panelists and get us underway. Thank you again for coming.
Good evening, and thank you very much for being here. I hope you all escaped the unexpected rain. I always expect the Weather Channel to tell me when it's going to rain, and when it doesn't, I feel somehow betrayed. So hopefully all of you escape that. Thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to the panelists. It's a extremely apropos time, it feels like, to be talking about women, leadership, race, etc. And as I was preparing for this, I know you don't want to hear from me, so I will stop in a second. As I was preparing or sort of reading about this, because I'm obsessively reading about stuff like this, I was reading Anita Hill's opinion op-ed in the New York Times in response to James Damore's firing after his letter that he wrote in Google. So you all know what I'm talking about. Yes, okay. And the thing that she said that's sort of interesting and that perhaps may spark conversation is, and I'll quote her, Google's decision to fire the employee responsible for the memo neither dispels the notion that a systemic problem exists nor solves it. There's much more that I will sort of bring in to talk about, what happened. But I think it's an interesting moment to talk about it. I'm a faculty in the Gender Studies department here at Hunter. And the fact that we are actually still talking in 2017 about whether women are biologically capable of, crossing the road and chewing gum, is kind of staggering to me. It's like, really, we're still back there? And I, as somebody who is sort of invested in teaching, the question that always occurs to me is what accounts and how do we understand the remarkable resilience of such a concept and such a belief, right? And how does it seem to persist regardless of efforts to debunk it over and over and over again? The format of the evening is going to be where I am not going to introduce the panelists individually. You all have and should have had on your seats their bios, and they are incredible and amazing. I invite you to read them. What I will begin is setting out 2 questions, and that I'll ask the panelists to respond to. And after that, we're an intimate, nice group. I'm asking all of you then to sort of jump in with your burning questions, because that's why you have come. You have lots of questions. So let me begin with the 2 questions for the panelists, right? And I'll begin with a broad one, and then we can sort of maybe move to specifics. So I'll ask the panelists to sort of comment on these questions, each one of them. So I want to begin by asking all of you, what does leadership mean to you? What have you learned about leadership that you perhaps did not know going in, now that you've, in a position of leadership? So that's the first question. And the second question is, what impact does gender have on leadership? The conventional wisdom is that more women and diverse people in workplace is better for the organization. But while that is true, women are not necessarily inherently better. We can point to several examples of women who hold views detrimental to women and minorities that does not necessarily advance a more progressive cause. So what does leadership mean, and what do you think, women and gender have on leadership? I will begin from my left.
I didn't realize I get to go first. Well, it's great to be here. So what does leadership mean? So to me, leadership is about mobilizing people in any different, there are different settings. There are corporate settings, there are social settings, there are many, many different settings. It's the ability to mobilize people to achieve whatever it is you're trying to achieve. I use a very broad definition of leadership, and core to it to me is followership. So the ability to set a view, set a direction, have a goal, and it could be the moment of crisis, it could be a turnaround of some kind, it could be just in the normal course of a day. The ability to set a vision, direction, a goal, and then to be able to get people to follow you, if you are the leader, to achieve that goal is the way I define it. And not because that person is, part of the hierarchy in a military or part of your employee base, but because they actually believe that you have a vision and they believe that's the right thing to do, and they're inspired and motivated to do it. So that's kind of how I think about leadership. It's more about followership than it is about leadership. Does gender have anything to do with it? Now, that's an interesting question. I believe that it should be gender blind. Like, people are capable of being a leader from, irrespective of shape, size, form, nationality, you pick your favorite dimension of differentiation, right? I do believe that, leadership is sort of something that it's easy to talk about. You see it when you see it, right? But you should be able to draw leaders from all walks of life. Now, I'll tell you, it's interesting. I started as a physicist where, frankly, I had a male name. So until you meet me, see me, or see a picture of me, you think I'm a man. Right? So I always thought it was an advantage back then. So I started life as a physicist where pretty much there were no women around. And I now work at MasterCard, which is, much the opposite. We're 40% women. I think our board has women on it. Our executive committee of 8, there are 2 women. Management committee I sit on, out of 20, there are 3 women. The North American Management Committee I sit on, our head of CFO is a woman, our head of HR is a woman, our head of digital products is a woman, our head of merchant services is a woman, our head of digital clients is a woman, our head of merchants is a woman. Obviously, I'm a woman, even though I have a man's name. And so about 75% of our management team is a woman. So, just sort of that's the contrast, right, in terms of my career. So my answer to your question would be, it should have no bearing on who becomes a leader. But in the 20 years I've been in the working world, I've seen a fairly big shift from, and there's a long way further to go, from being, you need men and women in a workplace to embrace diversity, because we're all in it together. We've gone from having many leaders be largely male to seeing increasingly more women. And so, and I think you'll see more of a balance going forward, I hope.
Hi, it's wonderful to be here. So I work in big law, and I've been in big law for about 17 years. And if you guys know, there's not a lot of gender diversity in big law. So I am coming from a little bit of a different place as far as MasterCard, or at least at senior levels. But to your first question, what is leadership? So I think leadership is really an investment and a commitment to do something bigger than yourself. And I think one thing I've learned that I didn't know was that it comes in a lot of different forms, right? So I didn't think about leadership really like sort of in an official capacity until you sort of get into places where you are just naturally in a leadership role. And then you decide then whether you're going to look inward or outward and what you can do. And so in my 17 years, starting sort of 16 years ago, when you first have someone else to sort of supervise or mentor, that's where I started to really look into what my strengths were, and then decide that I did want to be very invested and committed to this, and decided that, spending time developing relationships to help other people, whether they were men or women, was an important part of what I wanted to do with my life. And so for me, that's what leadership has been.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, India Center Foundation and Hunter. I'm humbled to be in present company and on this panel. I guess for me, the answer to the first question, what is leadership, is I think setting an example. It's very personal to me. It's what I learned. The very first person that I worked under set an example for me every single day with what she did. It was a woman. And so I almost naturally absorbed that. And to me, that became the model, if you will, of what constitutes a leader. And in small ways and in big ways, every single day in what you do, you set an example, and unknowingly, you have an impact on your environment, on the people around you, on the various people that you touch. So I think it means setting an example, being true to what you're doing. And that's how I would answer your question. And in terms of what role gender plays, I agree with Raj that I don't think gender should have anything to do with it. It's like when you hire someone, right? You try to hire the best person for the job. You're not necessarily making an agenda to hire a man or a woman or one race or the other. It's the best person for the job. So similarly, I think it should be gender blind.
Shama.
As somebody who teaches in the field of public policy, I see leadership as an ability to set an agenda or advance an agenda for social change, or at least at a minimum, be able to work towards larger questions of a public good. That is critical in the field of public policy. The leadership there is about change making, and how we are actually improving or implementing strategies to improve the lot of folks who are more vulnerable, or at least advance policies where you are creating greater equality, greater equity, as it is known in my field, and actually improving or advancing an agenda of social justice. Now, when you think about traditional change makers in the field of public policy, you immediately think of legislators, people who are actually in the political sphere. But I will argue in public policy making, you actually have to think about change deriving from the community level onwards. So you are very vested in thinking about how leadership occurs at the community level through mobilization, through community building, through grassroots empowerment, through lobbying efforts, to the actual process of creating legislative change. But it doesn't stop there, right? You're also thinking about what impacts are being made, what impacts legislation has on ordinary people, whether there is justice or equity or greater benefits to those folks. So you're constantly measuring those impacts. So it's this entire arc of change making from the individual and the community to legislation and its impacts that you are completely vested in. Now, who makes those kinds of changes? Well, it can be people working at the grassroots level. It can be lawyers, it can be people, public interest lawyers, it can be people in legislatures as well. So it's the entire arc of public policy making.
Thank you. So I want to go back to something I think, Monica, you raised, which is, or you alluded to, which is the idea of perhaps mentorship. And Anu, you raised it as well, like you had a mentor. So can perhaps we go around and talk about, do good leaders need to be good mentors? And have you had good mentors?
So, in law firms, a lot of times there's a lot of infrastructure around these things. And I wanted to talk about something you guys raised about gender blind, because it's something that comes up a lot in that we are so skewed at a certain level that we can't be gender blind anymore, because we have to figure out why we are, for example, only 20% of women partners in large law firms are women. To have that, so we can't be gender blind anymore. And part of these different programs, and we can talk about sort of specific things, but I'm sure we all have experiences with sort of infrastructure change on it, is mentorship is a big piece of it. And there's always questions of, okay, is it informal mentorship? Do you have specific structured mentorship? I've always had mentors that have been informal, and mostly women. And I've also been an informal and a formal mentor. And at the end of the day, it comes down to your relationship and how much time you put into it. I mean, whatever you call it, but I think it's critical. Just all relationships and networking, it all kind of comes together, and it all comes back.
I, as I mentioned earlier, had certainly someone that I looked up to, that I started my career under, and that person was my boss, but in my mind was a mentor to me. Now, in my workspace, we do actually have both structured and unstructured mentorship. As you will read from your programs, I work at Sotheby's, which is an auction house. And for the largest part, it's a 300-year-old business. And for the largest part of its history, it has been about making money. That's what the business does. It makes money for our clients and our shareholders. That's what we do. However, in the 21st century, you have to be doing more than that. You need to be increasing diversity in your workplace, for sure. You need to be more representatives, as in you as an organization should reflect your global clientele. That which surely makes sense. And then, of course, we have all of the corporate social responsibility that we do, which each of us actually participates in. So it's not just giving money to some charitable causes. We take time out of our lives to volunteer. We volunteer with educational organizations, we volunteer with City Harvest, we do all of those things. But coming back to the mentorship specifically, yes, we are assigned peer mentors. I've been mentored to other people in the organization. And then we also have something called the trainee program, where the HR department puts out calls to all the colleges for young graduates to apply for jobs. They go through a very rigorous 2-day interview process, and then after they join, they are mentored through that first year. as they enter the workforce. And this is actually gender blind. It's men and women. Although I confess that in arts, it's very skewed. We have a lot of women in the workspace. Shama, we had talked a little bit about the survey that was undertaken, and then the results were published in January 2016. 1,000 arts organizations in New York City were interviewed, volunteers going all the way up to the board, and I believe that the results were that 53% of the workforce in arts organizations are women, 47% are men, and apparently this mirrors the gender makeup of New York City itself.
Really hard to beat that. You know, it's interesting. So I've been, over my career, parts of, and actually even as a student before that, been in formal and informal mentorship programs, right? So we have our range of formal mentorship programs. We have a number of informal programs within, within the firm. And I've also been part of mentorship programs that are more structured, that are more global, or outside the firm that I work at. So for example, I was part of a really interesting program, really exciting one with Fortune this year, where I was paired with a woman from Kenya and a woman from Poland. And I see a couple of MasterCard people in the room who met them, who we essentially brought in and mentored for 2 or 3 weeks in the firm, and then they spent some time in DC, and then they went back to their countries, entrepreneurs. So I've been parts of, a range of different types of mentorship programs. And as I step back and think about it, the word mentorship or mentor itself has so many different meanings, right? It could be anything from an informal advice kind of, that I've gotten or I've given in a setting where it could be one time at one end, to a sort of a more sustained, constant relationship that is, that has a repeat interaction and has a very deep, over my career kind of relationship. So myself, I've had a handful of mentors. I can count the number of people who've actually made a huge difference to me over the last 2 decades on one hand. I've had a number of informal mentors who've been very good to me, but there are a handful of people who've really shaped my career, is the way I describe it. And to me, in terms of the people that I've mentored in all these different contexts, I always say you need to have something in common. You either work together, you have a common interest, you're doing something that sort of builds that relationship. Otherwise, it ends up being at the extreme of, the spectrum I was painting, where it's advisory and it's a one-time interaction. So for it to be really meaningful, it has to be, I think there needs to be something you do together or have together, and it's sort of more of a repeat interaction where, you're helping somebody through through many steps of a journey. That's the way I think about it.
So, as an employee of City University, the question of mentoring and guidance is a very central part of my job. So, those of you who know what CUNY's demographic and profile, the students who come here are fierce. They are passionate about what they do. They're committed to a higher education, but they do not come from privilege. So what mentoring means to them is disrupting systems that they have been part of, right? So disrupting systems of inequity that they have been part of, and which would probably lead them into another further cycles of remaining kind of outside mainstream life in America. So what do I do as a mentor? I stretch them and push them towards achievement, and this is what all my colleagues at Hunter College and CUNY do. We push our students towards achieving more, pushing them into systems of and ranks of privilege that they would not have normally have had access to. So whether it be getting them internships at Brookings Institution, or picking up the phone and calling the dean at Harvard, Kennedy School and say, listen, I have this student who might not fit your demographics, but trust me, she's brilliant, she's going to change the world, and you've got to take her. That's what it takes to be a mentor to certain kinds of people within which is my world right now. I have been lucky and very fortunate to have been mentored by a wide variety of people, but mentoring is not a passive act. It also requires the person to actually meet you at least halfway, if not more. So which means that you you provide them structures of guidance and open up a world that they can imagine, to which they respond positively. So it is actually at least a 50-50 world, right? You can only mentor so much. If the person is not willing and ready to be receiving that mentorship, it's not going to change. But the question of how to disrupt structures that exist is central to the core of mentorship.
Thank you. So I'm intrigued by this gender blind thing. So let me sort of turn it around or something and ask perhaps for you to tell us your narratives about, all of you are in positions of power and leadership, right? However we are defining that leadership, right? As all of you sort of said, leadership can mean different kinds of things. People can be mentors in all kinds of ways, etc. So you are, in significant positions of power in the institutions you're in, and by that position, by default, in a certain kind of leadership role. So can you perhaps just tell us what that journey has been? What have you faced? What barriers have there been? What challenges have you faced? What have you overcome? How did you sort of navigate that journey for us? We'll begin with you, Monica.
It's interesting, right? We all have our own paths, and for me, I think the biggest distinction was that because I don't think I achieved what I have because I'm so special. And if you look at the numbers, you might think that. But I think I chose to have children. I had children after I sort of achieved a certain level of success. I don't know if the same thing would have happened if I had had my children first. I think that is, and I think about that a lot as I mentor and sponsor women in my field, because there are ways, and I think culturally and institutionally, at least from a legal perspective, there's a lot more acknowledgement of it and need to know that we need to fix things, and you can't just pretend that it's all fine, at least until we live in a society where men take as much paternity leave as women take maternity leave, which we're not at yet, which is also something else I promote. So as far as, that's where when I think about the most important things of my path that brought me here, that's probably the most significant. And the second, as far as going back to sort of how I got to where I am, it's probably just perseverance and having some thick skin and, letting things, go by when you might get, otherwise very, there's a chilling effect if you think about things too much. And so if you just keep going, you're still standing, and that's probably the most important piece for me.
Thanks, Monica. Just before Anu gets in, the other things that I want to sort of put into the mix is also, we are all women of color in positions of power. This is not insignificant. So there are definitely racial dynamics and other kinds of things. I'd like for those of you to perhaps even articulate and sort of make that a little bit more audible. Thank you.
So certainly for me, Rupal, your question was, what was the path? Now, I had the Indian and Southeast. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. I was just saying that, Rupal, I think you were asking what was my path. I had the Indian and Southeast Asian Art Department at Sotheby's. It helps that I'm Indian. And I had promised my fellow panelists that I would have a funny anecdote or two to share, and I'm very happy to share it with them and with all of you. Now, when I joined Sotheby's, which was in 2003, they had an Indian department there starting from 1985, although the company itself had been selling Indian art for more than 100 years, actually. Now, no prizes for guessing if they had ever employed anyone who was Indian to have a permanent position. There had been consultants, but never anybody with holding a permanent position in that department. So in that sense, I was a first. And I certainly credit the people who hired me, very much non-Indian, for recognizing that and giving me that opportunity. So that's point number one. And then having joined the organization, mind you, I joined at a very junior level. They used to call me senior cataloger or whatever that meant. So it was a junior level position, but it did have a heavy lift. So I represented the face of the department internally and externally, of course, to the world of clients, but internally within the organization as well. And there would be times when I would be participating in meetings, let's say, and I would just find people looking at me. Now, it was a fairly homogeneous mix in my workplace when I first joined. So I would just, in the middle of my sentence, suddenly find somebody looking at me. And then I didn't stop. I did not stop. I carried on. As Monica said, you just have to keep carrying on. But then afterwards, I did ask one or two people that, what is it? Why do I see people looking at me? And then, of course, the person I asked was one of the people who hired me, and he said, with that accent, you could get away with murder. And I said, oh, okay. I didn't dwell on it, though, and I just thought to myself that, you know what, if you like my accent, good for you. If you like what I have to say with that accent, even better, even better. And so I carried on. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, what you are and who you are. Your work will speak for itself. So once people figure out that, you know what you're doing and you know what you're talking about, the respect and everything else that comes with it, the credibility that comes with it, follows naturally. So that was my path.
So it's interesting, as I was listening to you guys and thinking about my journey, I've had a handful of mentors who've really made a difference. I've had a lot of people who've advised and guided and given me opportunities, but a handful of people who've really made a difference. And I think I share your view that, without them, I don't know if I'd be here. What's interesting is that they're all male. And the other thing that's interesting is two of them are Indian men, right? Just I don't know whether that has any significance. It's just, it is what it is. So, the other thing I'll say is, it's interesting you talked about the accent, right? When I was younger, I always said, wow, I stick out like a sore thumb. I'm an Indian woman. I have a strange accent. I'm often the only one of my type in any room. I don't really think about it because half the time, I only think about it when they realize I am an Indian woman and I walk into the room because they're expecting an Indian man, right? So it's kind of funny. It's I never really dwelt on it, but I thought of it as something that was stood out like a sore thumb. But actually, as I've grown in my career, I've actually come to realize I like it because they remember me. I'm different from anybody else in the room, and they remember me more than, if you have to be memorable, you actually automatically develop a personal brand because they remember you. They remember what you said. They at least remember your strange accent. So it's, I think there's a lot of benefit to that. Now, the other thing I'll say, you said, what was some of the challenges? I think I'm going to echo what you said. So I have two children. They're now in high school. And the greatest challenge was trying to figure out how to balance that when they were little. Not now. Now it's actually quite easy. Relatively, it's harder in other ways. But when they were little, and I was traveling and working and I had young children at home, I actually went part-time for 2 years. And then I ended up switching out of consulting and taking a job in the city with less travel when they were young. There were lots of trade-offs that I made, and I was a little concerned about how this would impact my career. And it didn't. Actually, as it turned out, it didn't make much a difference. Now, what's interesting is my husband's a 50-50 partner, right? He does. I can't do what I do and I can't travel if that weren't true. But we live in a society, and this is where gender comes in, where it's hilarious, right? The school, the pediatrician, even our babysitter, right? So I might be in London at a business meeting or and she'd have seen him. This is when they were little. She'd have seen my husband leave the apartment in the morning. But when there's an issue at 11 o'clock in the morning, I'd get the call, and she knew I was in London. She knew he was there, and he was like an equal parent. So these are some of the challenges one has to overcome when you're a mother, a woman, and you have a professional career.
Yeah, it's a great question. So if I can sort of just think about how we all got here, right? So I grew up in India. I was born and raised there, and I came to the US for college, came to New York City for graduate school, thank God, and I never left. So it's almost 30 years in New York itself, and I always know when I'm outside the city or I've traveled outside the state, because when I start speaking, people's heads go like this. So their heads are cocking because they're trying to figure out what exactly I'm saying. So it's, again, that accent piece, but thank God I live here, right? So many people sound like us. I think investing in myself in my 20s was critical to where I am now, and also bringing with me a sensibility that I had being raised in Calcutta, which was a real appreciation of politics, because those of you who might know India, it's a highly political city, and so an appreciation of politics and certainly an appreciation of larger questions of equality, social justice, reform agendas, and so forth. So I trained as a political scientist. Right through, I knew I was not cut out for a corporate world, and I also was possibly not even cut out for the legal world, although I had kind of played with the idea of going into law. I'm very happy what I did because my training allowed me actually to breach fields. I went out of academia for a bit, and I worked in research, and I worked in the nonprofit world. That's where I cut my teeth. So I made all kinds of networks and contacts in the field of social justice, in research and policy, in gender equity issues, in policy in Washington, D.C., global policy making before I came to academia. So my route has been much more circuitous, but I think my work now is much more enriched because I see all the subtleties and nuances of careers outside academia, and I can bring my learnings into what I do, and especially in the way I teach and in the way I mentor and the way I open doors for the next generation of students. I feel blessed that I have done that. In terms of a challenge, it's interesting, a lot of you talked about the race or the gender piece, and I feel, Raj, that you talked about the motherhood piece, the parenthood piece is possibly one of the biggest challenges that I have faced. There's just so much I can do in terms of travel or in terms of working on a career when you've also got children to raise. So it's just not possible. And like you, I'm the #1 contact in the pediatrician's office, even though I might be somewhere else. I have been on panels, discussions like this in Washington, D.C., and the phone is ringing from the class teacher. And I know I need to take that call because that is a call that I cannot miss in case something has happened to our children. So the motherhood piece is a huge challenge, and it is not addressed in American society, how to be a parent and how to be contributing to your careers at the maximum. It is one of the biggest gaps that we have in our public policy. It is one of the biggest gaps that we have in American capitalist systems, in our corporate arena, in our nonprofit world. We just haven't figured it out in this country, how to be parents and how to manage the piece about work and home. I know there's a lot of discussion around work-life balance, but when you really think about it, who is doing the balancing, and is there, in fact, a balance? And the reality is that it's not a balance, it's actually a blend. We bring our home into our workplace, and we bring our workplace into our home as well. So doing that amazing juggle is not always successful because something has to give. And until we realize that we are blending all aspects of our life, there's actually no real solution.
Okay, I of course have a million questions, but I'll restrain myself and ask 2 last questions, and I'm going to open it up because I know you have burning questions. And I'm looking at all of you, you have burning questions. Okay, so I'm fascinated by the discussion on sort of motherhood and what it does. And we could spend the rest of the evening here, hopefully get the bottles of wine down here and talk about, and talk about what has happened in terms of the sort of discrepancy in terms of parenting. And lots of women in in careers talk about, for example, within the academy, it's very much about talking about sort of the child post-tenure, right? And what does that do? And I know, Monica, you raised it in the context of big law and having children later in life, and what does that do? And sort of alluded to the fact that it could have impacted your career. There is, from what I understand, I don't know this, but from what I understand, within the corporate world, in fact, there seems to be better mechanisms in place to bring back into the fold women who have gone away to give birth and have children, or men and women have gone away in the adoption of a child, etc. Sort of bring them back into the corporate arena and to sort of integrate them into the systems that have been taking place, because it takes away. So perhaps each of you can say really briefly a word or two about that, and what does that mean? What do you think about it?
Yeah, I think the world has gotten a lot better since I had children. As far as, at least I can say in the law firm context, there's a lot of programs. My firm has this amazing program that is, after you've given birth, at the first 6 months, you work at 75% and you get paid 100%. And most importantly, it's not an opt-in. Everyone just gets it, because there's always an issue of tracks. There used to be something that people would always say sort of informally of, oh, well, she's on mommy track, which is obviously the most insulting thing to say. People don't say things like that anymore, but people can still think them. So changing these things is really important. And so I'm very proud that we do this program. And everybody seems to be, we'll see. There has to be digestion and see if there's any impact of it. But when I think about the balance that you mentioned, I also am sort of, I have to say lucky, but I have a 50-50 partnership with my husband. We are absolutely 50-50. I actually think in our case, our nanny calls my husband more than she calls me. But you still are, your society, who you work with are still, at least who I work with, are mostly men, and at my level, mostly men, many of them who have a spouse or partner who takes care of everything. And that's something that when you think about how you progress in competition, I mean, that has an effect. And then you think about what that sort of broader ripple effect is culturally. And I think that's, for me, I think about that as the crux of the issue.
I'm really happy that this subject is being discussed, and I'm not at all afraid to share my personal experience with this. It was not easy. It was definitely not easy. It's a 300-year-old business, as I said, and it's supposed to make a profit. Now, 55% roughly of the people who work there are women. And up until the time that you actually have a child, it's all very fine and supportive and so forth. After you come back, it becomes interesting. Then it becomes a personal situation. What your equation is with the person above you, the person that you report to. In my case, certainly as Monica said, there were people who had spouses who took care of everything. So that it was a struggle to have to say that, I've been up all night tending to a crying child who has a cold or who has fever. And so I'm not here at 9:30 for X and X meeting. To the extent that I went to our human resources department, I sat down there and I said that, look, this shouldn't be so difficult to understand. It's not an excuse. Put yourself in my shoes. Everything that everyone else is doing is just a little bit harder for me to do because I have this extra piece. Just take 2 seconds and digest that. After I said this, surprise, surprise, things changed for the better. So Rupal, to go back to your very first question, what is leadership? It's taking a position, it's taking a stance and setting an example. So that was certainly my experience. And of course, it is much better now. But I'm really glad that I took that stance. And I was surprised and disappointed that I had to in the first place. But I'm really glad that I did. And it is much better now.
I was going to say it was not easy, right? When I think about it, so when I went part-time, it was unusual to go part-time in a consulting firm. I was a bit of a guinea pig. I tried it one way for 1 year, another way for the second year, and then finally gave up and said, no, this is not working. I got to come back full-time, right? And then actually eventually said, I have to leave the consulting firm. This is not working at all because it's either being full-time here or not doing it. So it wasn't easy at all. And what I'll say is that, and actually it's interesting, Monica, before I talk about sort of what we're putting in place now, and I think it's better now than it was before, but there's a lot more we can do. It's true. At my level, most of the people I work with, either the men have spouses at home, or actually in my case, the few women often have husbands at home, right? So it's unusual to have, we have 50-50 parents, but unusual to have both parents working, right? And in fairly demanding jobs. So it's interesting. You select to do it, right? You own your choices. What I would say is that, we have a lot of programs now, not just at MasterCard, but across the board in corporate America that are better. There's a lot more to do. I don't think this is the end of the journey. So for example, I do think it's easier to go part-time now in most places. I do think it's also, when people come to me for advice about either stopping because they have young children or going part-time, I now advise them to go part-time, whereas 10, 15 years ago, I wouldn't have, right? Because I think it is easier to slow down the treadmill and then speed it up than to step off the treadmill and step back on it. It is much more viable now. And having said that, we also have a number of programs at our company, and then I also know of other companies that have similar programs where we bring women who have chosen to step out for 5 years, 10 years back into the workforce. Initially sometimes starting on a project basis, starting on a consulting basis, starting on a part-time basis, and then over time bringing them in full-time. I have a number of friends who are sort of my age who actually stepped off and took 10 years off and are now back in the workforce, in the business world. Some of them are in the legal world. And so lots of examples of that now. Now, having said that, while it's better now than 20 years ago, I think there's a lot more that can be done.
So before I came to Hunter, I was at a gender research institute, and one of the areas that I used to work on was kind of family leave policy and looking at how women managed family and home and balancing. And what we found was actually the corporate sector was miles ahead in instituting changes and reform. And I really think it was because there were shareholder interests in mind and they actually had to implement measures because otherwise you were going to lose an entire part of your labor force once they were of childbearing age. So it was very interesting to see how law firms and corporations were actually instituting what was then called off-ramping and then on-ramping again, really finding ways in which women could successfully manage families, have children, and come back and still be a valuable and contributing member of your corporation or your law firm. I have to say nonprofits and academic spaces have still lagged behind. Academic world, women, yes, there is stopping the tenure clock, right? You have to make tenure within 7 years or you're out, and there is now definitely some recognition that women in their mid-30s, early 30s are thinking about having children, and then how do you incorporate? But that it's not, especially for women in the sciences, it is not a sympathetic world. I mean, I think women in the sciences probably have the hardest time kind of being competitive in their fields, managing their labs, and then, of course, managing their families, and of course, if you have to travel and so forth on conferences. For myself, I think I have to say that having a partner who is 50-50 is critical to this. None of this can happen without. But I also have to say that you have to be somewhat sneaky in this business. You actually have to find ways to balance your life and your home, whether it means that you just at some point start going home at 4 o'clock in the evening because you've been there since 8 o'clock in the morning, right? Or whether it means that you sneak in a way in which you can go be at a parent-teacher conference at noon time and then come back and finish your day. Or you leave in the evening, put your children to bed, and then you're up all night till 2 o'clock in the morning trying to write up your reports or trying to write your paper or grade papers or so forth. So when I say the word sneaky, it is actually just taking what you think needs to be done until it becomes practice in your department or your boss starts getting used to the fact. So again, I think the question is, how do you disrupt these systems, these larger systems that happen? There's part of it which is of working with sympathetic bosses, but also stepping up and saying, hey, this is what it needs. If you want a valuable worker in the workplace, you're going to have a loyal worker in the workplace if some of these reforms and some of these changes and some of these adaptations can actually happen.
So a lot of very rich anecdotal and other questions. I'm sure many of you have things to say and share, so I'm going to open it up. Don't be shy.
Hi, my name is Himali, and I just have a question regarding the last statement that you made about taking what you think is needed and essentially becoming a leader in that and situation at work with having a family. So I was told in an interview for one of my positions that you belong to the organization from 8 to 4. And whether you have to pick up your kids or anything like that, it's not our problem. So, but your hours from 8 to 4. So how would you respond to that? Like, what's your advice?
So if you haven't noticed, that's what I've been advocating here, some form of radicalism. Yeah, incremental radicalism is something that I actually was just introduced to. It's tough, right? I mean, you want to put your best foot forward, and I think in many ways we've all paid our dues, right? We've all been there where we've worked long hours, we've depended on the generosity of strangers and neighbors to pick up your child, mid-street somewhere, ear infection in the middle of the day, somebody's had to run home. We've all been there. And I think there's a little bit of setting a track record where you are a valuable employee that can be depended on, and therefore you will never let the organization down. If it means you're not doing FaceTime at 4 o'clock in the evening, if it means that you're ready to join a conference call on a weekend, I think there's your adaptation and your kind of flexibility along with the company learning to know you. Now, how that starts off right up front in a new job, in a new interview, is definitely difficult, and I give it to you, right? It's very hard to right from the get-go start kind of taking time. I think you definitely need to lay that track record where you're getting the job done. It doesn't matter if you're in the office, whether you're away on a beach or whether you're at home. You need to be dependent on, and you are a leader in pulling all of that together. So yeah, I think it's a bit of kind of smile, grin, bear it, grit, perseverance, all of those kind of issues that you have to kind of figure out. But the trick is really finding a sympathetic boss.
I'm going to open it up and ask more questions. So maybe we'll just collect maybe 2 or 3 so that a lot more people have a chance to, think about it. I'm going to ask Raul. You have your hand up? Yeah.
I hope this comes across articulately. I have a question about being Indian and being a leader. So this may kind of go beyond the gender question, but since we are here with 5 women leaders, maybe hitch gender and Indianness together. Is there some essence in either being Indian, being raised in an Indian home, being educated here as an Indian, that makes you more likely to be a leader? Is there some essence in the way you were raised in an Indian community that makes you more likely to be successful? If you understand my question, is there something about that upbringing and that community that leads to leadership?
I think about this a lot with my kids because I do think it was a huge part of my success. My parents were, we all have stories of parents immigrating here with $8 in their pocket and making a wonderful life, and we were scrappy, and it makes you hungry. And my kids are being brought up in an Indian household, and I'm not sure how hungry they are right now. So I don't know.
I will say this. I'm a first generation immigrant. What brought me here to the US was my marriage. I married somebody who lived here. I didn't come here to study. I didn't envisage a future outside of India, and I certainly didn't think I would be sitting on this panel here talking about leadership. No, sir, definitely not. But certainly, Rahul, and this might seem a little bit cute even, but growing up in India, when I was young, we watched Mrs. Gandhi a lot on TV. And, when you're a little kid growing up, now she was a strong, strong person. And there are many opinions about what sort of leader she was. But I'll tell you this, I watched her on TV every evening. It almost seemed very natural. And then in school, you learned about all the other women, who were important in India's freedom struggle, et cetera, et cetera. So those were almost taught in school, or you saw them growing up as examples. And so that's what inspired me.
That's interesting. I grew up in India and I came here as a student, like a couple of the others here on the panel. I don't know if there's, so I'd say the same thing in that, yes, I can attribute some of the things that my parents taught me, the hunger that they, instilled in me, the hunger that I had coming here as a student with nothing in my pocket, right? But having said that, I don't know, in answer to your question, I would question whether there's anything inherently Indian about that, right? Because I think it's more, I really do fundamentally believe that leaders come from all different sources and all different backgrounds. It's more a question of whether somebody wants to embrace the opportunity. I agree with you. You've got to, direct your own destiny to some degree. You make choices, and you need opportunities, right? Things that come your way. But I don't know if there's something inherently different about my being Indian that, that makes a difference.
Rahul, that's a great question. And I think I want to push back a little bit and say it's less the issue of being Indian, and for me, the issue of being an immigrant. And I think for me, that has been the kind of the fire in my belly, right? So no kind of inheritance to fall back on, or no social padding that I was here by myself and I had to figure it out. Right? It is literally that $20. And in those days, more than 30 years ago, there used to be all kinds of central bank restrictions, and you could only take out $20 in currency to come to this country. So literally, I arrived with $20 in my pocket. So the fire in the belly comes from the fact that there is nothing to fall back on, right? It is yourself and yourself creating that destiny without which you are pretty much sunk. So for me, my choice was shamefacedly going back to India because I had no money and I had never made it or didn't get into graduate school, or trying to chart a course here using every faculty I had about me, every wit, every sob story I could muster about why I needed financial aid so that I could go to graduate school. And then really realizing that the only way I was going to get jobs is through that networking piece and talking to people and all the soft skills that are required beyond just training myself. I needed to make that happen for myself. And like you, I watch my children. They don't have the fire in their belly. They are soft. They're middle-class children growing up in Forest Hills. They've got 2 working parents. There's no fire in their belly. They've got tennis rackets when they need it. They can go when they need a tutor, they can get that. When they need endless amounts of compasses and protractors, they get those too. So in many ways, if you all remember that book, very contentious book about tiger moms, right? She had a follow-up book, Amy Chua, which she basically said, it's really the first generation of kids who will kind of make their way, but by the time it's the second and third generation, they're already soft, the immigrants.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sometimes wonder if that's an immigrant's bias, right? Because there are many leaders who are not immigrants, but I share that view. But on the other hand, we happen to be immigrants here on the panel. There are lots of people out there who are leaders who are not immigrants, so it's interesting.
So many questions. I'm going to use up my privilege as being a moderator and also respond, Rahul, to your question. So the word essence for social sciences raises like a red haze specter. You're just like, oh my, it's the E word. Amongst the entire alphabet, quite frankly, has a lot of red herring words. But I mean, I think I'm going to push back or sort of respond and complicate the narrative a little bit in terms of, the fire in the belly. And first of all, to answer directly to your question, is there an essence to being Indian, to being becoming whatever? The answer, from my part, absolutely not. It's nothing essential. Right? I also think that, the journeys that all of us, I would reckon, have taken has everything to do with the fact that we are Hindu, the fact that we come from upper caste backgrounds, the fact that we came as middle-class people. Everything. Like everything, right? Sure, we came with fires in our bellies. We worked hard. I had to beg I remember days when I was at a graduate school, I had $20 in my entire month to spend on whatever else after I had paid for everything. All of those things, and story after story, evocative, beautiful, struggling, energizing, enduring stories about all the struggles that we have done. At the end of the day, though, I knew for a fact that I would not go hungry. I would nevertheless be safe. And if I had to go back home to India, that would be fine. That is not the journey for a significant proportion of the planet. It just isn't, right? Syrians, people from what are designated Islamic countries, whatever. It's a very different narrative. So when I think about journeys and stuff, that's the stuff that looms large for me. I will stop, I promise. I can go on. As you can tell, I can go on. I feel a lot about this. Okay, so I saw a hand here. I'm going to take all three questions, yeah? The gentleman in the front.
My name is Chandrakant Pancholi, and I have just three short questions. One is about grassroots movements. Don't you think it will take 100 years if we go through the grassroots way rather than producing lawyers who can make a change through courts? And secondly, do you think that the maternity leave hurt your chances of progress? And third, do you think any mentor that gave you something that sticks in your mind and it helps you in a leadership way? Because I was coming out of the subway and I tried to make some people follow me and everybody refused.
Hi, my name is Tina Angle. So you all have, had great success in your respective fields and have achieved a significant level. A part of being a great leader is confidence, that people will believe you and give you that business to run, right? Or, different things. How do you build or sustain that confidence despite being the sore thumb? The sore thumb, the odd one out, yeah. All right, I'm going to hand up. Then I think we're first. Here, you go ahead and then I'll...
So hi, Anushree Bagrodi. I'm a senior counsel at MasterCard. I think all of your journeys are very, very inspiring and very touching, and I can identify with different parts of it. But when we talk about leadership, and you've all demonstrated that leadership means different to different people. But during your journeys, did you think about your leadership brand? And did you try and build on it? And what does a leadership brand mean to you?
Sorry, do you have a burning question? You really want? Go for it. Go for it. It's fine.
So, a comment and a question. So I'm the daughter of immigrants, daughter of a very staunch feminist father, and a mom who's not a feminist, but was a working professional, a college professor my entire life, still is. I grew up second generation, growing up on Long Island, and what was visible to me prior to Take Your Daughter to Work Day, which we didn't have when I was a kid 35 years ago, was that the value of an Indian woman defined as auntie in my world, was simply how great her chola bhaturas were. Not anything else. That was not what I was visible, what was visible to me, what I was privy to. It was her cooking in the kitchen and how nice her saris were that I saw. And that was something that I felt very deprived of because I heard wonderful stories about my mom getting great accolades for being a very beloved college professor, or my grandmother being the founder of a university. And I heard stories, but I didn't get to see anything. So what I really appreciate tonight about the Roosevelt House and in the India Center putting together is giving us the opportunity to see all of you wonderfully accomplished women. And I wish I had been experiencing this my entire life. So that's my comment. My question, though, is can you comment candidly about your experience of encountering other Indian women or women of Indian origin in a professional / networking type of context in your careers? And has that been something that has been competitive? Has it been something that has been nurturing, encouraging? I'm very curious to hear what has been your experience of other Indian women. You come from such different backgrounds, but within your individual industries, what has been that experience?
I'll answer that one. I have a short memory. I think it's interesting. People say a lot that women can be more competitive and, almost be detrimental to the cause, and that's a whole another day. But my first mentor when I was a summer associate, 18 whatever years ago, was an Indian woman. One of my closest friends, most recently, who's more senior to me, was an Indian woman. And out of my sort of handful of sort of people who I'd call mentors, important people in my life, that's not an insignificant proportion of them. And what's interesting is, in these cases, neither of them were that clued into being they weren't really that Indian, if you know what I mean. Like, they weren't as culturally in tune with everything that was going on, but there was some connection, there was something. And even now, when we have amazing Indian junior associates, and I'm drawn to them, even though I never, I didn't go to a ton of Indian things. I wasn't very involved with like the South Asian legal, school groups in law school. But there is a nice affinity, and it has to be real. And in my case, it has been really real and something I'm grateful for.
Can I ask this gentleman's question about the role of grassroots group versus legal groups and how they play? I don't see them as an either or. I think in order for us to kind of advance democratic processes, movements need to be built, whether it be affordable housing or immigration rights or reproductive rights or equality, inequality, environmental issues, freedoms, LGBT issues. I mean, the whole range of kind of the social, economic, political questions all have to start somewhere by communities defining what they need. Lawyers are absolutely indispensable to this. They need to be able to frame the issue and mount legal challenges if there are indeed violations or compliance issues. But whether it's in India or whether it's here in the United States, I see the role of grassroots groups as the stewards of democratic processes. And I see the institution and the liberties and freedoms that are accorded to grassroots group as part of any decent modern society. We can't do without that. And I also want to go back to the lady at the back who talked about what I feel when I meet other Indians. I love it. I'm drawn to other Indian women wherever I go to. I look out for them. My accent slips. I want to take them home. I want to show them to my children and say, look, there's another woman who just looks just like me and talks just like me, right? Dresses like me. In a way, it's really a chance to bring my whole self. And although I have friends, all kinds of friends in all kinds of spheres, I think I very much, look, I'm smiling. I look forward to meeting other Indian. There's no competition at all. I think it's very much more collaborative and sharing of experiences and sharing of how to live and be and all the kind of intersections of race and class and gender that we encounter every day. Those are those are real discussions that we kind of instinctively know about each other. So yeah, make those Indian friends. They will definitely open your doors for you.
Actually, and I'll echo that. By the way, Shyama and I, our mothers were friends. So talking about, Indian women being friends. So, I want to answer your question, which is, I think the way just my view, the way you respond to adversity, and whether it's a difficult situation, whether it's a situation, or a difficult set of circumstances at work, at home, personal, or sort of for the group, I think is more defining. Because it's much easier to work in an environment or to react when something good is going on around you, or something good is happening to you personally. So I think my answer to your question would be, when you're in a difficult situation, whether individually or collectively, how you respond to it, how you think it through, the grace with which you handle it, right, is critically important. And that defines you. And then your brand question, what I would say is, I always think of brand as not what I aspire to be, but what people say about me when I'm not in the room, right? That's really the definition of brand. And that's tied to your question. How you react to adversity is something that defines you, and it defines your reputation. So, not every moment, not every situation is positive, right?
I'll actually pick up on that, Raj, and address your question as well as yours. Again, it's very much what you're doing or you're setting as an example in that particular situation, and to actually introduce into this the prism of the Indianness, right, of the leadership brand, or the Indianness with which you're dealing with a difficult situation. Now, again, I speak very personally from my own experience in my workspace. Like I said, when I started, very homogenous workspace, people were looking at me and my accent and so forth. And then over the course of 14 years that I've worked here, I think they see me as somebody who's very tough, because I fight. I fight for my point of view. I argue my position when when I'm trying to get a point across. And I have no problem in sort of telling everybody that, look, I am where I come from. I am the product of a system which is extremely tough, which delivers you a lot of hard knocks at a very early stage. And this I think also applies to those who came here as students with the $20 in your pocket. And when you were growing up in India as well, to the question and the comment in the back also, and you're growing up in a conservative society, and you're gaining an education. Why? Because you want to come here and do graduate school or achieve something. You fight, and then that's what your brand becomes, as someone who stands for something that you believe in, and you're ready to push back to get that and represent that.
Thank you. Those are great. We're coming towards the end of the evening, so let me just say a couple of things. I think it's really amazing to hear all of your stories, so thank you for sharing them. It is also remarkable and amazing to hear, the grit, the personal determination, the sense of wanting to fight. It is also heartbreaking that that's what you need to do in order to stay safe, to secure your position, to ask, frankly, for your right, rather than the fact that there should be systemic, structural change. It's 2017. We need to be there already. But let me sort of conclude the evening by a few things. To thank Rahul Bhavnani for having this, organizing this event, Shyama and Manu and Harold and everybody else at the Roosevelt House that made this happen. Jen, thank you for orchestrating all of this. This is a long conversation. Obviously, lots of people are hungry for it. And so I ask that you come back and continue to engage. There'll be many such other events that are taking. And last but not the least, please join me in thanking the panelists.